It's every parent's worst nightmare, children at risk. But the list of dangers facing the children of the world grows longer and more terrifying every year. Child soldiers, prostitutes, refugees, victims. But how are the most vulnerable among us to be guarded, and what can be done for the millions of children already in harm's way? Coming up on Great Decisions, Fight for the Future, Protecting Children's Rights.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust.
And now from our New York studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
The numbers are astounding. Worldwide, there are 13 million child refugees, 2 million children involved in the commercial sex trade, 300,000 children in armed conflict. 246 million children work in unsafe conditions, and between 35 and 40,000 children die every day. Some argue that the best way to help children is through economic development and reducing global poverty. The European Union has pledged to spend billions to do that. Others favor more targeted approaches to specific problems, such as the Bush administration's pledges to fight AIDS and to reduce trade barriers. Meanwhile, UNICEF and the United Nations are focused on the reduction of child mortality and universal primary education. Private foundations have begun to play a more prominent role as well. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have merged their considerable fortunes to create the largest philanthropic organization in the history of the world, and they're targeting their gifts to helping vulnerable children. And Hollywood has also pitched in. Movie stars travel to some of the world's poorest places, sometimes to adopt children, but always attracting media attention to problems people in rich nations rarely see. Next on Great Decisions, are children's rights around the world being overlooked? What can be done, and who will do it? We are joined by Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland and United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who now serves as President of the nonprofit organization Realizing Rights. Welcome to Great Decisions, Mrs. Robinson. Appreciate you being here. This problem of children in the world seems to be something of an invisible one. In the developed world, we don't really hear about it all that much. Why is it so difficult to focus attention on it?
It really is astonishing that we're not more aware of how many children are suffering when they wake up hungry in the morning, suffering because they're being abused, suffering because girls are shoved into a brothel and have to service grown men day after day. I've met a 15-year-old in Cambodia who told me her story, and I was in tears, as she was. And yet I know there are hundreds of thousands of children caught like this, caught in the most horrible daily grinding work. No joy, no toys, no relaxation. It does seem strange that this can happen and we're not daily putting it at the top of our priorities. We should be.
You've traveled around the world to see this problem. Do you have to travel really in order to see it? Is that the problem?
Well, not really, because domestic violence happens anywhere, and we actually have situations of exploitation of children in the developed world or in rich countries. And that too is shocking. And yet, when we look at the numbers, the number of child soldiers, I remember sitting with children who'd been rescued from being child soldiers in Freetown in Sierra Leone during the conflict there. An Irish NGO, Goal, provided a shelter for them. And we sat with them, and through an interpreter, I asked them, what do you really want? And without exception, they wanted their parents. They were just little kids. And when we look at the statistics about health, the right to health, because children have the same rights as adults, and the key rights are under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But because of the vulnerability of children, in 1989, the governments of the world drew up and agreed to honour and uphold the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's the most ratified convention in the whole world, thankfully, by 191 countries. And it recognises that children need special protection from violence, from abuse, from neglect. And yet, look at the statistic on health. Over 35,000 children die every day, children under 5 die every day from either hunger or preventable disease. And I try to think of that now in terms of a word we learned, the terrible word tsunami. That's a silent tsunami of children every week dying under 5. It's 52 tsunamis every year. Why isn't the world stopped? Why are we not stopping all the other things we're doing and saying, how can this be?
It's a considerable achievement to get all those governments to sign the documents, but if nothing's done about it and that the statistics are showing that the problem is getting worse, how do you feel about how effective international organizations have been?
Well, actually, there are people who are working very hard on this, notably UNICEF, the main UN agency. It's in its 60th year, and it is worldwide doing an extraordinary amount of work. There are also wonderful voluntary organizations like Save the Children, for example, which again is very worldwide. And there are many women's groups that adopt issues of children. What they're doing is trying to hold the governments to accountability. And they're doing very smart things in some African countries, some South Asian countries that I've come across. They're looking at the expenditure and the budget of a country, because the commitment is to progressively implement the rights of children to education and to health. But if you don't budget for it, it won't happen. And, you know, millions of girls never get into school, millions of children. Over 100 million of children in 2006, 2007 don't go to school at all. And the majority of those are girls. And this leads to another problem, particularly in countries of high HIV prevalence, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Because of the fact that girls are not important, that they don't have power, they're more vulnerable. And we have these terrible figures that in some countries of sub-Saharan Africa, girls between the ages of 15 and 24 are 6 times more likely to become HIV positive, to get AIDS, because they need sex for food sometimes if they're very poor. Teachers demand sex for grades sometimes. Uncles think they'll cure their problem if they have sex with a virgin. And you have rape, and these are not exaggerated problems. These are real.
You've seen them in Southern Africa. You've seen them in South Asia as well. Yes. Why can't that problem of abusing young girls sexually be dealt with? Isn't that something everyone would agree upon?
There is a lot more attention, particularly to trafficking. We know now that there are criminal gangs making huge money in our world in trafficking and smuggling human beings. And the difference between trafficking and smuggling is that trafficking means from the beginning you're in a trap situation. The girl that I was talking about in Cambodia, her uncle and aunt brought her into Phnom Penh saying they had a job for her in a clothing factory and pushed her in the door of a brothel. That's one case of that.
And then she's trapped there probably for life, right?
But very often women read advertisements in very poor countries that they can be waitresses, that they can be, and they travel under the auspices of these criminal gangs. As soon as they get to the country, their passports taken from them, they're told they owe a terrible amount of money, and they work as slaves, sex slaves, or just slaves from then on.
That happens in the developed world too.
It does, yes. I'm very sorry to say that there is a lot of trafficking for abusive situations into countries like the United States. And it's something that needs more attention and is getting more attention. But one of the areas that I feel has reached a rather positive level is the recognition of the importance of girls' education. It links with the development experts, governments and development experts generally in the United Nations, recognizing that women are vital to the progress of a country. And one of the characteristics of the Middle East, of the Arab world, is that women haven't been given enough opportunities, and that's also changing. But in order for women to take their full place, you need to educate girls. And I'm very glad to say there's much more attention being paid, and it's not just enough that girls get primary education. At the moment, there's still the imbalance. There are more girls out of school at that level than boys. But we also need girls to have secondary education, to protect themselves, to go on to learn skills, and hopefully, indeed, to go on to university, third level, college, technical college education.
Is that kind of thing happening also in Africa and South Asia and Central Asia? And
it's not happening enough, but there is a realization. And yet, I'll tell you an example of how it's hard to prioritize. I'm one of these people who goes to the World Economic Forum in Davos every year. And with a number of other women who go there, we've been trying to get a plenary about girls' education because it's so vital to development.
Have you been able to do it?
Not quite. We're really trying now. And, that's the thing. It's sort of a marginal subject. and yet it's absolutely central. And we will have much more rapid development in countries because they will do it themselves, because women will empower themselves, they'll get the microcredit, they'll get the jobs. It's not saying women are better than men, it's just we need to harness the energies of women who are very keen to feed their families, to provide the possibilities.
Here in the United States, saying that sounds like apple pie, you know, it's a natural thing, but there are many cultures, you mentioned the Middle East, India, another place where to suggest that a woman should be as well educated or as empowered, to use your word, as a man is countercultural. Don't you have to deal with that problem too?
You really have to deal with that, and often by just having a network of women in a village, you can deal with that better than many other ways. I mean, I've seen that happen. I've seen a network of women tackling genital cutting, this female genital mutilation, which so many girls go through, and it's an appalling situation of a kind of violence, and yet it's justified as being cultural. It's actually a harmful traditional practice, but there's no good in somebody coming in from the outside. It has to be women themselves who stop it. And there's a very good study that shows where women have even primary education, the number who will allow their daughters to go through this drops. Secondary education, forget it. University, it's out
of the question.
Out of the question. So that's one of the ways. But also, we need to see women exercising more political power and decision-making. I became a member of the Irish Senate at the age of 25, and there were only 4 of us. We couldn't do as much, but when we became 13 out of 60, we had that critical mass, and critical mass is very important. Michelle Bachelet, the new woman president of Chile, who took office as a single mother who had suffered and been imprisoned herself, so she knows the tough side, she decided that 50% of her cabinet would be women. And she said a nice thing. She said, I had no trouble, she said. There are many talented women I could draw from. And there are talented women in every country. And actually, a lot of our focus in realising rights is in Africa. And I am constantly kind of taken aback in a nice way by the energy and the power and the increasing involvement of women in Africa.
I don't want to take attention away from that, but there is another problem in Africa as well, which we haven't really mentioned much so far, and that is there are some countries, I'm thinking of Uganda, Congo, Sudan, and there are others, where young boys particularly are forced to become warriors. They're given guns that are sometimes as big as they are. They're firing automatic weapons. They're being used as chefs, cooks to supply military units and so on. That's another kind of slavery, isn't it?
Very much so. And again, I've met quite a number of child soldiers, and I've spoken to Olaro Tunu, who's done a great deal of work on child soldiers with his mandate. It's actually both boys and girls. Girls sometimes have the gun in their hand, they're forced to, but also they become the sex slaves. It's a
for
whole,
the armies, yeah.
Yeah, for these children. You know, it's really very frightening to see how terrible it is. And children are snatched. It's happening in northern Uganda still, and other parts. And it's very hard for those children to learn again, even to be a child, and to learn. And once a child has had a gun in the hand and felt that power in a street, it's awfully hard to get them out of it. And I mean, we hear these stories of some children in Somalia whose first name is AKA, because the AKA rifle is so prevalent. And, that's the kind of deep sadness about it. But there are good programs to get children to to give these guns up and begin to be both secure in being fed, begin an education, but working through that trauma takes a long time.
You can't just target the children there, though. You've got to target those who are essentially encouraging them or requiring them to serve in the armies.
And actually there is a protocol about child soldiers prohibiting and giving people a way of having a tool of accountability. And I'm very glad that the United States has ratified that protocol on children in armed conflict. Because curiously, the United States is one of 2 countries that hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The United States and Somalia are the only 2 countries not to have ratified. A while ago, there was a specific reason for that, because the Convention on the Rights of the Child doesn't allow the death penalty if the offence was committed when the person was under 18, which is the child. But your Supreme Court, in a recent ruling, decided under a US Constitution that would not be allowed. So it's time to reopen a debate about the United States ratifying that convention to add to the protections under US law. And also, if you ratify an international convention, you can promote it more strongly internationally.
You mentioned a few moments ago the problem of AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, it's not just there. India has the problem as well. It's increasing in China, too. AIDS, when it comes to children, causes particular problems. You mentioned some of them earlier, but it also causes problems in terms of civil society. Where do you get a good police force or a good army or whatever if your children are stricken with this disease? Tell us a little bit more about the impact AIDS has in southern Africa, perhaps, but elsewhere as well.
It's having a devastating impact. It's almost hard to go into a village now and see some of these grandmothers looking after 19 grandchildren, or not even necessarily related, because the parents are dead or the parents are too ill. And you have these very poor grandmothers who hoped that their children would see them into a quiet, dignified old age. And you see 9-year-old girls. I met a 9-year-old girl I was introduced to recently in Mozambique, who's had a younger brother and sister, and she's one of many, many AIDS orphans. It's a huge problem. How can you call a child a head of household at the age of 9, 10 or 11? And yet that's a reality. I'm a grandmother myself. I'm lucky enough to have 2 little grandchildren in Ireland, and that really brings it home to me. You know, children need their parents, they need grandparents, they need that family circle. But in the Toronto AIDS conference recently, some of those grandmothers from the developing world, particularly from Africa, were brought to Toronto to tell their story. And of course, they'd never been out of their villages before, and they told a wonderful story that was compelling of how they tried to cope with the almost impossible situation, how much they love those children, what they will do for them. And yet, again, we need far more attention to this.
Great Decisions spoke with Peter Piot, Executive Director of UN AIDS, about the impact of HIV/AIDS on children around the world.
Yeah, children are often the forgotten face of this AIDS epidemic. And let's not forget that half of all new infections are happening in young people. In some regions, like in Eastern Europe, it's teenagers that are really the main affected group by HIV. We've got 14 million orphans, mostly in Africa, because they lost both their parents or one parent because of AIDS. And that results in unprecedented situations. So in a country like Swaziland, 1 out of 4 households is headed by a child. A 14-year-old, that's not what you're supposed to do when you're a child. And why is that so? Why is that so?
So do you think that targeted efforts that are intended to solve the AIDS, HIV problem will actually help in the situation with children, or is that not going to be enough?
One of the things we think is going to help is if we can get women in positions where they can do something. In fact, Realising Rights has helped to bring together a network of women ministers of health, which is co-chaired by the Spanish Minister of Health and the Minister of Health of Kenya at the moment, very committed. And the idea is to prioritise women and children in the context of health. And afterwards we'll bring in all the good men ministers as well. It's not intended to exclude them, but start with the women. And if you look at maternal mortality, women dying just before or during or immediately after childbirth, the figure is not improving. It's more than 600,000 women. Never practically happens in the United States or in the modern Ireland. It's an acute problem, and the hospital is traumatised if a woman dies giving birth. But it's all too common. And then the figures of babies dying, most of them die within the first week or within the first month. So if we can address that, and foundations have helped, foundations like the Gates Foundation. I serve on the fund of Gavi, G-A-V-I, which helps to immunise children, and UNICEF and all the other agencies and governments and also Save the Children and those locally are involved in Gavi, which is providing vaccines, which is providing immunisation. But there are still tens of millions of children who have no vaccination, and that's not tolerable. Gordon Brown did a very good thing recently in persuading governments to adopt the finance facility, and we have a special finance facility for immunising children. So suddenly the capital markets are helping to reach more children. And that, to me, is the 21st century way. We need governments, United Nations, World Bank, We need the private sector. We need business.
You talked about the 21st century way of dealing with this. What about the celebrity efforts? Are they useful? And if so, in what way? Are they useless?
I think everything is useful because, as we started with, it's shocking that we're not aware. And when people go to Darfur, like George Clooney did recently, when a number of very good ambassadors for UNICEF or ambassadors for UNAIDS go and use their celebrity to draw attention. People want to photograph them, and who are they with? They're with orphan children. They're with poor grandmothers in a hut. Yes, it matters, but it isn't the full answer. I very much admire the work of two Irishmen, Bono and Bob Geldof. They're giving their time because it's on their watch, but it's on the political watch. It's on women leaders' watch. That's one of the things I'm saying. This is happening during our time, and each of us could do something. And that's back to Eleanor Roosevelt. She said a wonderful thing when she was responsible with a group of jurists for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She said, if human rights are to matter at all, they must matter in small places close to home, so small that you can't see them on any map of the world. That's the village in South Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, where children are dying, where children are in child labour, where there are child soldiers. And then she said that if anything's going to happen about that, it must be concerted citizen action. And that's all the non-governmental organisations. And what I like to do, and I do it a lot when I speak, is say, yes, Eleanor was right, but now we have to have a 21st century addition to what Eleanor said, and that is we need to have human rights matter more in the corridors of power in order that they will matter in the small places close to home. And the corridors of power are the UN, governments, but also multinational corporations, the boardrooms. They have to be talking about their accountability in our globalizing world for the fact that millions of children die unnecessarily, suffer unnecessarily, are not protected.
We've been talking about numbers, and you just mentioned them again, numbers of children, but there actually are places in the world where the number of children is simply unknown. There are kids who grow up without documents, without a passport, certainly, without identification papers. And so do we really know the extent of the problem?
Not exactly. I mean, Archbishop Desmond Tutu recently rode in on this problem of the fact that there are millions of children with no birth certificate. And countries make it too difficult. They want it only to be in registration places or in hospitals. A lot of births don't take place in hospitals. Why can't we have mobile clinics that at least ensure that every child has a birth certificate? So, of course, we don't always know the numbers, but I think UN agencies and others have become very good at extrapolating. And, for example, nobody seriously questions that figure of about 35,000 children dying every day, children under 5, of preventable diseases, diarrhea, measles, sheer hunger. That is a reality. And that reality will, I think, get worse potentially because of the demographic realities, that we're going to see a bulge of 3 billion new people, and most of them will be in the poorest countries. And the countries with these problems already, which will be aggravated. The shanty towns of the big cities will become more and more spread out with possibilities of disease and airborne illnesses, etc.
Talk about the demography again for a moment, because that's a problem particularly in South Asia, in Southern Africa, and increasingly in the Middle East as well. Lots and lots of young people coming onto the scene there over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Yes, and maybe that's where we can find a real connectedness, because that's obviously unstable. You have angry, even humiliated young males who can't get jobs. I was a member of a Global Commission on International Migration, and at a hearing in Cairo, we heard that North Africa needs 100 million new jobs between now and 2020. Nobody foresees those 100 million new jobs. Are they going to become manipulated into being part of, the spreading of the Al-Qaeda-like? And what's to stop them if they become literate and they find the world they see on television, the waste in our part of the world, the sheer abundance of everything and waste about it. And they feel this bitterness against their own government, but also an anti-Western sentiment. We have every reason to know that the world is very connected now, visually, because of television in particular. And therefore, there's a them and us, which if it becomes very divisive, we will feel it. There's a way of saying it, that if children in our world are not safe, none of us are safe. We really, and that's what's so good about the vision of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was under American leadership, Eleanor Roosevelt. She's a heroine to me. I know she's a heroine to many women in the world. But it took a challenging vision, and it does matter, because once you have conventions, once you have laws that governments have accepted, civil society, groups of women, groups fighting poverty, groups promoting children's rights can use these to shame, to name, to hold to accountability, sometimes to go to court.
Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, now President of Realizing Rights, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thanks for being with us on Great Decisions. And thank you as well for being with us on Great Decisions 2007. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust.